Album number two in a different genre here. We're going to go to some rap. We're going to go to Ice-T, who I could not believe, Josh. When this album dropped, did you know Ice-T was almost 30 years old when this album
Wow.
dropped?
No, I did
Yep.
not.
He was born in 1958, and this one came out in 1987. So, yeah, Ice-T was pushing 30 years old when this came out, which I had no concept of Ice-T in the present day being 65 years old. Did
It's
you?
no, and in
Okay.
some ways, I imagine there's a whole generation of listeners that only know Ice-T from Special Victims Unit.
Well,
Law
like
and Order.
Ice-T's like had like three lives, I feel like,
Yeah.
right? There's like the life where he was like a criminal
Yeah.
by his own admission, like legitimate criminal, like robbing banks, pimping, all the things. Like, and then there's like the rap life of Ice-T. And then there's like Ice-T actor and celebrity on SVU and New Jack City and that show with his wife, who I think her name is Coco,
Coco,
right?
yeah.
And I just think of her as just being like walking curves, right? Like it's kind of like how I describe her. And yeah, and then he just sort of shows up, and he's like one of those guys that like lived like like a gangsta life, right? But became mainstream. But unlike say like Snoop, who, he had the murder case, right? But pretty much everybody else says outside of that, he was, kind of there. Like Ice-T was living that life,
Yeah.
in a way that was authentic. I have to give him credit in that sense, but also you kind of cringe at like knowing that like he's talking about it for real, not,
Yeah,
playing.
he's drawing on life experiences.
So,
And,
yeah.
and I would say, getting to the album in some respects, he's drawing on all those experiences and putting them in the raps on this album. And would be a big example in the earlier days of rap of the gangster rap genre, and also kind of the criminal, talking about crime and the crime life in the same way that, KRS-One did when we talk about Boogie Down Productions.
Right.
And,
Well,
in
that's
that
the
vein.
Well, that's the interesting thing, because I always think of Ice-T as being a West Coast rapper because he came out of
that's funny.
LA.
Yeah, it's funny
But
you
this
say
is-
that. Yeah.
But a couple different things, and I'm going to let it go. He was born in Newark, New Jersey, and lived there till 14.
Yeah.
And this is very much sounds like an East Coast hip hop album.
Yes.
Like, full stop.
Well, even on a song like Make It Funky, which is the third track, he's calling out, New York boroughs and it's
Yep.
very New York sounding.
Well,
in
and
some
sampling
respects.
Boogie Down Productions, like The
Yep.
Bridge is Over, and like the DJ work here. So that really caught me off guard because I never listened to this album. I'm like, I was thinking I was going to get a West Coast album, and this holds way more in common, like you said, with Boogie Down Productions, which KRS-One is in, who you mentioned,
Yep.
or the sonic palette of, like even early Run DMC. There's things because he's sampling rock all
Yes.
over this album.
Yep.
Mhm.
And kind of some of the delivery and sound effects too are from the samples are reminiscent of that. The other big one would be like Slick Rick too. That would be kind of in the storytelling ability of his songs and the explicitness on some of his songs.
Yes.
He's definitely akin to that.
Well, he's got a little bit of Public Enemy in him too. That he's always done these social commentaries. But the thing that's always interesting to me about him is that like he's got a little bit of the Tupac thing where he'll write like a profound social commentary, and then he'll write like a super misogynistic, homophobic, like glorifying crime type, and it's like you get both, right? You're like,
Yep.
This is an interesting mix. Whereas somebody like Public Enemy, right, was like leaning fully into like the consciousness, right, or like NWA, right, was leaning into that life, right. Like here, like Ice-T seems to be like, no, man, like there's a part of me that is going to speak truths, but also be aspirational and positive. But then there's going to be a part of me that just very casually, says pimping ain't easy. And like, not like in the way that other people say it. Like, I get a lot of women. Like, no, like the game of pimping
Right.
ain't easy. Yeah.
So
Which-
had you heard this album before?
I am much more familiar with Body Count era
Okay.
Ice-T, which is
Yeah.
like early 90s. And so I was a little bit prepared for the fact that this was going to have almost like at times like a metal or hard rock sound to it. And it does. I feel like the difference between this and all the other rap that we've listened to is that this leans into the hard rock sound way. It's like a rap slash rock album in some ways. Now, there's always been rock samples all over, especially New York hip hop, right?
Yep.
They're West Coast not as much, but New York famously, you got Walk This Way and Rock Box and from Run DMC. The Beastie Boys had plenty of rock beats. And it was just it was a part of the beats that they sampled, right? Was hard rock, but this seems to almost have its sensibilities from hard rock. Now, when he gets to Body Count, he's basically playing with
Right.
a metal band behind him, right? So he kind of leans all the way into it. But one of the things that I found really interesting was some of that was because, Ice-T was kind of raised, upper middle class in New Jersey, but then his mother and his father died. And that's when he ended up in LA. But even there, he ends up in like an upper middle class neighborhood in South LA, but through, that era that we sometimes forget when they were actually trying to not they were doing busing and different stuff to actually have racially mixed schools, right? As opposed to like gentrified schools, kind of. He ends up going to like sort of like a more la-di-da middle school, and then he goes to like Crenshaw High in the 70s for, which is majority minority, and obviously difference of socioeconomic class. I also think it's interesting, like, and you see it in this album, for as much as he's talking explicitly, he avoids cursing.
Oh,
Did you notice that?
Yes.
Like he chooses all the time to not curse.
Yeah. But he has
which
no
means he
problem
had to have-
talking about sex.
Yeah, explicit sex and
Yeah.
violence, right? But
Right.
he always, when he has the choice of cursing, and I don't know if that's he's trying for radio friendliness and if you notice, there's really not a lot of cursing on East Coast hip hop in this era.
That's
it's
true.
still
Yeah.
it's still a little bit playing it clean. And even when I think of like East Coast hip hop from the 90s, I don't know if I process them cursing as much as like the West. Maybe it's just my own mind, but yeah, Ice-T was a teetotaler his whole life. I thought was interesting. No alcohol, no cigarettes, no drugs. Like famously, he basically identifies almost as being straight edge.
Wow.
Yeah, and so I thought that was interesting. But yeah, after he graduated high school, he pretty much for about 8 years he went back and forth between the military and crime. And he basically he unveiled a lot of it when he was aware that the statute of limitations had worn out, and he talked about like being a bank robber in Hawaii and all kinds of different stuff that he was doing. Like he pimped out there and stuff. So, but he kind of left it behind around 82. By his description to make it as a rapper, and then kind of never looked back, it seems like. Yeah. So
Interesting dude. He's always very outspoken on Twitter as well. He has some fun
Oh, really?
things, especially against like politicians and
I would imagine he leans to the left based on the bio I read.
Yes, he does.
There was something where he mentioned that he was going to say positive things about John McCain because he didn't want to get in the way of Barack Obama getting elected. So he figured he could lend his support by seeming like someone who was co-signing McCain. So I don't know if that was it sounded as much joke as anything else, but some of his takes seem to be what we would call left of the spectrum, I'd say.
Yeah.
Was that how his Twitter comes across or no?
Oh yeah, he was always talking shit about Trump and like and all sorts of insane things that politicians do. So yeah, definitely.
Yeah. So, yeah, and this is for those that the other thing people who may not know Ice-T very well may know is sort of the whole cop killer song
Right. Yes.
controversy, but that's not until Body Count comes around. That's not till the early 90s. So this is several years ahead of that. Yeah, so we'll kind of leave that out of this conversation because let's go a little bit into the album itself, Josh. I know that you've often talked about the fact that you know, I was gonna say hip hop, but then I think of the lineage that Ice-T comes from. Like he mentions hearing the Sugar Hill Gang and being influenced by Public Enemy and Rakim, and I want to call it rap because those guys are very outspoken, especially in the modern era of saying there's hip hop and then there's rap. And what I do is I do rap. And even like Eminem has sort of leaned into that a little bit more. And so I think like Ice-T would probably identify as a rapper more than a hip hop artist, right?
I would think so. Yeah.
Yeah. So what did you I know that this is a genre that holds a special place in your heart. It was a seminal genre for you growing up. I listened to my fair share, but I feel like in some ways your spiritual connection is the strongest. What'd you think of this one?
Hadn't heard this album before, and I thought it was okay. It is harken back to kind of the lineage of the early '80s rap in some ways. It's the rapping itself is kind of that basic structure. Although he does rap faster in some songs than others. I think the beats are and the sampling are kind of reminiscent of the early '80s rap as well, or mid '80s rap. So he's not really transcending anything or kind of reinventing the genre yet in the way that I would say Public Enemy or the Beastie Boys.
Well, he's not leaning into his gangsta side like he would in like original Gangsta, right?
Yeah.
Which comes later. Yeah, he's still in a crossroads, it feels like.
Yep. Yeah, and it's like a really solid, I guess, template for what a lot of other rappers would do. I mean, I guess the main thing is that he is, so goes deep on kind of the criminal lifestyle and kind of money, cash, and hoes, and the and sex, which he has a whole.
It's
song
all a
about
gentleman
sex.
knows,
Yes.
Josh.
And so on that front, I think he is at the forefront in terms of vividness and telling stories, and just what I guess being true to his self ultimately, himself. And so while I enjoyed it, it did not transcend some of the other rap albums that I liked more. I think it's but like you said, you bring up a good point about hearkening to or at least leaning into the heavy rock side of things. I really kind of like the opening intro that he has. I think that sets a different tone in the first track, and then at the end, bookending it with Squeeze the Trigger, and kind of like there's this like really awesome like bass beat on that track, and then at the end he like dedicates the album to the Rhyme Syndicate and kind of other people that have helped him with the album. So I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, this before I go into my take, can I bring a couple things that we might have taken for granted that are fantastic about the surrounding album? First of all, this cover is awesome. It's like Ice-T in a ride with just one of his boys behind him.
Yep.
A very attractive girl who I found out later was like his long-term girlfriend.
Right.
Pre-Coco, I think, was there.
Playing into the West Coast thing too with the palm tree in the cars. That image. Mm-hmm.
So definitely a great album cover. The MC name Ice-T is an underrated MC name.
Yeah.
And the album title Rhyme Pays is also pretty fantastic as a title I'd like to mention. Yeah. So that's there. I'd like to also throw a like the folks around this, which I think the beats on this album are what I'm going to talk about quite a bit. So I kind of want to shout out the people that like are on it, both because I really like love the beat sounds, and also like I love the names of the people on this. You've got DJ Evil E is on this, DJ Aladdin, and the producer of the album is Africa Islam is the name of the producer.
He shouts him out too. All of those people on the album. Yeah.
Which ties into if you go back and listen to our paid in full Eric B and Rakim thing, I go into a long thing, which I don't know if it bored Josh or Matt or anything, but like about the connection of like the Five Percenters and just
Right,
sort of the
right.
influence of Nation of Islam. It was all around Public Enemy. We talked about it there. But when you're naming yourself Africa Islam, you know what I mean? You're you're both back to Africa, and you know what I mean? You're tied into sort of that black Muslim thing as well. So I just chuckled when I saw that. I was like, it's like naming. I'm trying to think of like what the equivalent would be. Like I don't know. I'm not going to go down that route because I don't want to misspeak. But the standout for me, Ice-T as a rapper is fine. I
Right.
wouldn't say he's great, but I certainly don't think he's corny. He's got a decent flow. You know what I mean? He varies it. He said he kind of patterned after Schoolie D, which you could definitely see a little bit for those that might be familiar with what he sounds like in early New York hip hop. Seymour Stein, the label mate, said that he thought he sounded like Bob Dylan, which I found fascinating in the bio. I have to admit I did not hear that,
I did
but
not either.
but hey, Seymour Stein has sold a hell of a lot more hit records than I have, so maybe he's on to something. But yeah, but I didn't get that. I just wanted to add that in. But yeah, I think the standout for me is I love the beat selections on this. Like you mentioned, the beginning is great. The interludes are there. There's also some songs that start with one beat and then change to a different beat halfway through, which is not something. And I'm talking like not just like have an interlude and then go back to the main beat, which is pretty common. I'm talking they have like a main beat and then it switches over to like a completely different main beat for the second part of the song. So a lot of these tracks run long too,
Yep.
which I found interesting. Probably for my taste a little too long. I think it's kind of they're designed to be played at parties.
Yes.
You know, what we used to talk about with disco, right? And hip hop's origins came from disco to some degree, and there's still a little bit of vestige of that. I get the feeling Ice-T knew his way around the party, albeit staying completely sober at said party. But that's okay. You could party clean, But yeah, the beats are really what stands out to me. I love the selection of a mix of hard rock slash metal, but more hard rock, I'd say.
Black
There's
Sabbath.
like Black Sabbath, Led Zeppelin, like mainstream hard rock, but it's there, as well as other New York hip hop of the time. He's sampling a lot of stuff from that era
Yes.
in New York hip hop. There's a little bit of, we mentioned, Boogie Down Productions is in there, but I heard a little bit of LL Cool J. I heard little bit of shared samples that the Rick Rubin acts, the Beastie Boys and LL Cool J,
Run
similar
DMC
stuff.
too, I think.
Yep.
Yep.
So it's throwback to sort of those lineage of those songs. So it's like you're sampling the sample used in a track. So from that end of things, that's what really pushed this from a thumbs in the middle album to a slight thumbs up for me, is the idea that I was a big fan of the DJing and the beat selection on this. And there were times where I grooved to this like I grooved to a hard rock album. And that's unique because even when Run DMC or Beastie Boys were bringing it in, I still didn't think of those as, hard rock song. Maybe when you do like Rock Box, where the beat stays throughout as the main beat, you could process it that way. But this seemed raw from that end of things, and I really do like the meshing of hip hop and heavy rock. I think people are starting to figure out in this day and age, because there's a lot of people that identify themselves as hip hop heads who really also start to identify themselves as metal or hard rock fans too. It's becoming a thing, and I always thought it's much easier to understand that than historically it was. And we have examples all throughout the 90s and 00s of bands that combine those things, but still were kind of looked at as novelties. And I'm like, well, how long is it a novelty when tons of people do it for 20 years? And that it was a foundational thing for Run DMC and the Beastie Boys, and even like mainstream rock, like excuse me, not rock, mainstream rap of the late 80s and early 90s. Like we talked about, like Funky Cole Medina having like Jamie's Crying and stuff like that. I mean, there's rock beats as much as disco beats or funk and soul beats all over the place, especially in East Coast hip hop. Like I said, West draws a lot more lineage to funk and soul and covers like that. But East Coast hip hop has always sort of had a little bit of an overlap with rock because the foundational folks sort of embraced that as part of the heritage. So yeah, I would say slight thumbs up for me on this album.
Yeah, I'm gonna say slight thumbs up too. Enjoyable in certain respects. Some funny lyrics throughout. I like the idea of using 409 on your shoes to keep them clean.
Yep,
that was funny. So yeah, definitely check it out. It may not blow your mind, but I think you would get something out of it.
Yeah, and I listened to the one with the bonus tracks on it just out of curiosity. So the regular album's 9 tracks, starts at intro, rhyme pays to squeeze the trigger. I should mention that rhyme pays beat structure has War Pigs by Black Sabbath, and then has The Exorcist Tubular Bells, right? Is the real name of the song, I think. Yeah. Mike Oldfield, I think, is the wow, I pulled that one out of my ass. But yeah, it's a mix of those two things, but it really works for me. I enjoyed it quite a bit. So, and there's James Brown on Make It Funky, as any track with Funky should have. So